Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Airspeed Korra Rewatch video. This one's going to be for K205 Peacekeepers. And yeah, this is I think one of the weaker episodes of Book 2, and I'd say one of the weaker episodes of the entire series. I don't think it's the worst, but this, and as I've said before, episode 6, I think together make up a fairly weak kind of group of episodes. Not the worst in the series, but I think it has some of the worst kind of writing decision making in the series, and I think they're the two episodes that most distract from I think the other very interesting things going on, which is the kind of really good family stuff that we've had up to now, and then the spirituality elements. This is where they kind of start to get into a little bit more of the politics, and then especially the drama, I think, is just, really, really overdone in this episode. Especially the romance stuff, which is, I suppose, more or less the first time we have a chance to really discuss this in the rewatch, of just how badly written Mako and Korra's relationship is in this book, and specifically this episode and the next one, and just some very, very questionable decisions made by the writing team about the direction of where they were going with things. I don't think this is an out and out awful episode. I think it has its moments, because I do overall enjoy the Mako arc of no one's listening to him in this episode. Lynn especially isn't really giving him the ability to, I suppose, participate as effectively as he needs to be in these investigations, when he seems to be the one who's almost able to, on the right track to actually crack the case. I like the arc that he has over these kind of this next group of episodes, in that it is even though they don't give him the biggest moments, it's still a nice moment to see him kind of be redeemed after kind of everything that happens. The problem is definitely how they write him in this episode with regards to his relationship with Korra, and also how they write Korra in that as well. The big thing for me is that I don't feel you needed to have the breakup in this episode. I don't feel you even really needed to have that as a thing throughout the book, because ultimately the only thing it accomplishes is creating drama across the season. It splits up Mako and Korra so they can be very separate across the book, to allow Korra to have the beginnings thing and then come back. But then the only real thing that happens is that they then try to go for the Mako Asami thing, which they just don't commit to at all. So that's probably one of the worst writing decisions in the entire show. And then Korra doesn't loses her memory. I think this is a very questionable thing that they did as well, of Korra loses her memory, and the only real net thing that comes out of her not having her memory, the only thing it really accomplishes, is creating drama between Korra and Asami because of Mako and the relationship stuff and her not remembering things. And then it's basically just there to set up a secondary breakup scene that happens later on, which, now that all the issues are over, fundamentally, Mako and Korra are in a position come the end of the book where they're not actually disagreeing with each other over anything. They more or less have got past, I think, any of the issues that have been brought up in this episode about that would affect their relationship, yet they still decide to break up anyway. And I think that's a weakness of this episode, in terms of it not really making it massively clear why this is such a big problem in their relationship. Because I watched this episode and I've always interpreted it as they break up in the heat of the moment because they disagree over this very, very kind of heavy issue that has just come up, that is not going to be around forever, in that Mako, of course, cares about Korra's family and the South. He's just stuck in a tough position because he's a cop and is expected to do certain things, and is basically he ultimately answers to Raiko, and Raiko doesn't really agree with a lot of what Korra is proposing and what Korra wants to do. So that kind of brings Mako and Korra at odds, in that I don't really think it's personally Korra and Mako really have issues with each other in this episode. I think it's primarily Raiko creates this situation where Mako is almost forced into these situations. They try to bring a sort of issue of like both of them kind of don't respect each other's jobs as such. But I almost think that like I think that's just a part of their relationship, but that kind of has to be there because um fundamentally, of course, like Mako, Bolin, Asami are not going to have any particularly like amazing advice to give Korra as the Avatar. She can only really get that advice from the past lives, or potentially people who are very, very, very spiritual. Otherwise, she's more or less on her own. And then similarly, because she's in a position where she's expected to do so much, you can't really expect her to also play the other side of things and like play the cop's perspective, play the president's perspective, when she kind of has to play the what's actually happening in the world perspective. And because she is deeply invested in this, she knows that deep down what's happening here is that the North has invaded the South, and that the correct position for her to be on in this conflict is on the southern side, because she knows the truth about what Unalaq has done. And basically her frustration comes here from basically no one really listening to her as such. Which of course brings Raiko into play, and Raiko's a weird character because I think, especially like with Turf Wars now, it's always been this thing where like, are they purposefully writing him to kind of be a very ineffective president that doesn't really do that much and is just kind of out to keep his job as long as possible? Or is that just like a side effect of them kind of just writing him quite poorly, and we're meant to have a more neutral view of the character? I'm not entirely sure. Based on his portrayal in Turf Wars, I'm leaning towards him more or less meant to be somewhat of an inept president that more or less just got into power because rich people backed him, as we learn in this episode, and he was a non-bender candidate at a time when I think it was natural that a non-bender was going to be elected as the president. Because we're never presented as him having really done anything of note, like ever in his entire run as president. And what's presented in this book, the next book, even book 4, is just, I think, him making mistake after mistake after mistake, and nothing particularly good being presented about him. So it's always a case where, like, I get why people are critical of Korra in the scene where she talks to Raiko, but I can't exactly lean too heavily into, like, oh, I definitely understand Raiko's perspective and so on. Just because like he talks and is, when you like analyze everything he says, he's just like, okay, he's saying the right things to her, like maybe he can't do all this stuff, but then it's like, what are you actually doing to try and help something here? And the result usually is that he's not doing anything, because he tries to do the least amount of stuff possible while still coming across as somewhat of an effective leader to make it look like he's doing a decent job. Whereas like all he really does here is walk into the police station and tell Lynn to do her job better. That's the entirety of more or less what we learn of what Raiko actually tries to do with regards to investigating the South more. And so Korra and Varric, I think, are both proven correct when they bring up the fact that, you know, he's basically just out there for the publicity stunts of like the second Korra walks in, he just wants a picture of like him having met the Avatar, and he only really cares about, you know, the polling figures and stuff like that, making the decision that will upset the least amount of people while not actually making any sort of a effective decision. Now, not to say that I think he should have just immediately mobilized the United Forces and created this whole actual like full-on war, but I feel he could have done something, and his justification for why he decides not to do anything, I think, is actually quite poor. As Varric actually points out, the idea that like I don't think the Republic needs to get involved in internal Water Tribe matters, and Varric just points out that like no, they, as far as we're aware, the interpretation of what happened is that the North attacked the Southern Cultural Center during a march in Republic City by the people of the South who actually live in the city, and who also attended this thing, the Northerners, people from the North who also live in Republic City. So it's basically saying like a third of the population or so of Republic City is people who actually have their roots in this conflict. So to say that Republic City has no stakes involved in this, I don't think makes much sense, because the United Forces is meant to be, I think, the military for, like, in general, kind of like the world military type thing. Yes, it is the Republic City military, but I think the idea is that it's meant to have an impact on kind of everyone. So I think there's complexities to this, but I don't think it's as simple as just saying Korra was completely out of line in everything she did in this episode and Raiko was right, because Raiko doesn't actually do anything, so Raiko's not right. And then I think the context that you have to have for all of this is as well that Varric is sort of behind the scenes manipulating most of this, as we kind of begin to sort of get hints at that, as he basically says, and it sort of becomes a bit of a, like, questionable decision, that, like, if you can't make money in a war, when can you make more? And it's sort of the first time you really see him say something that kind of hints as to what he really feels about things. And the plan for, like, okay, we'll go behind everyone's back and we'll use Asami's company to basically supply, like, troops and, like, machinery basically to the south, and that's the best we can do right now. And he's definitely doing everything he can to, like, oppose Unalaq. And you can see that he's making these propaganda pieces. That's where the Nuktuk stuff comes into play as just a propaganda piece against the North. Obviously, we later learn he orchestrated the bombing, which obviously everyone leaned towards it being the North rather than being anything else, because that was the only real interpretation you could actually have from what happened. And it overall just, I think, comes together into a plot that is interesting, but I don't think given enough importance or given enough time across the episodes that cover it. I think part of it is that Asami begins to very much kind of drop out of the plot in the next couple of episodes, and basically as of the next episode she is more or less gone from being any sort of a noted role in this season, at least, by next episode. And even then, it's just about her company. It's not anything particularly personal about her, and the one thing they tried to do that's personal with her is just trying to start the relationship with Mako again. Nothing particularly interesting. So you can see the problems that are at play here. What's good is that Mako's getting a little bit of a spotlight, as he's clearly on the right track here, as he realizes that firebenders were actually the ones who, you know, set off the bombs. And he begins to actually track down the people who did it, and is ignored by Lin, which is another point that I think people criticize. This one I don't necessarily agree with all that much. Like the idea that, oh, I don't like book 2 because it kind of mischaracterized Lin. Lin would of course listen to Mako, and I'm just like, no, I get we now like Elaine after book 1 and that she's a very popular character. Doesn't mean she can't be flawed. We haven't really seen a lot of how she deals as such with every single member of her police force, or how she is as a leader of the police force. And so we see here that she, like some of the other officers, she kind of goes into the sort of culture there of looking down on the kind of newbies, looking down on the rookies and not really giving them any sort of respect. We as the audience know that Mako is actually extremely intelligent and can figure these things out very quickly. But Lin just sees him as the new guy trying to do too much and isn't doing the job that I suppose he was told to do, even though he's actually completely right on track, and Lu and Gon are the ones that are the actual idiots. So I think it's actually an okay arc, because the result, as we sort of later see, it's more of a subtle kind of arc across the series, but it is that Mako basically becomes Lin's kind of go-to guy on the police force as a result of what happens here. And I think that's a good arc of, like, she initially didn't see the benefit of what Mako was doing, and later had a complete turnaround to the point where he's her number one guy, and it's almost to the point like where a bigger arc for Mako going forward would be that we almost expect him to become the next chief of police. That makes sense to be kind of his arc, but it's okay what they do here. I think the issue is definitely that The way they wrote Mako and Korra in this episode is drama, drama, drama. They used the plot to create a drama between Mako and Korra, and use this as a way to set up a breakup to be one of the bigger plot points in the book, when it really isn't. They just break them up, and then they don't actually use any of the development to have really any of them really reflect on their relationship or anything like that. They just sort of stick to their guns and just like, okay, they're broken up. And I think what it misses the point on is stuff like the fact there's a 6-month gap between book 1 and 2. That Mako and Korra have been a couple for 6 months, and nothing really hints towards that much of a fact of like they argue all the time. They really have massive communication problems. A lot of this is just Korra at the start of this book having to deal with a lot of issues, learning a lot of truths about her family, lots of betrayals and kind of this stuff being revealed to her. Now her kind of home is at risk and there's lots of problems happening. I don't think it's necessarily the time with their relationship to make these like huge decisions of like, oh, Korra is like dealing with all of this like crazy stuff that's going on. Let's break them up because there's some issues going on. And like, why can't the characters be a little bit more understanding of like there's mad stuff happening here. Our relationship drama, okay, we have some issues right now, but let's see if they're still there afterwards. And I think that's what they kind of fundamentally miss out on. And they try to create like a huge rift, like something they can't resolve, unresolvable issue within their relationship, that there's this communication problem, that they disagree on all of these things, and this means that they can't be a couple anymore, even though they've been a couple for 6 months, just because they basically had a disagreement because Raiko forced Mako to tell the truth, and Mako is trying to be a little bit more neutral on the topic because he's a cop, and Korra obviously is wanting to save her home. It to me is extremely forced as a plot. I think there was a much better way to break them up, that it should have been so much better written than it is here, and this just feels like they went back to the drama focused stuff from book 1 for no real reason. And then the other thing is like, I feel it just completely forgets the, I suppose, magnitude of kind of Mako and Korra's relationship of like, they said I love you to each other, and it was like the complete romance arc from book 1, that initially there was a time where there was only one book of Korra, and it would have ended with Mako and Korra being a couple as one of like the last scenes. Why is that changing so suddenly? And it's not because I'm like super invested in Mako and Korra's relationship. I like it, but I'm not some huge shipper of it that I'm annoyed at it for that. I'm annoyed because it's just like they committed to putting a relationship together. A decent amount of time passes with them as a couple, and then they just like tear it apart to really no net benefit. There's, I think, only really negatives to take away from this, because what it effectively does is it creates this rift between Korra and Mako for basically most of the rest of the series, and their relationship doesn't get back to the way it was until like basically the last couple of scenes in book 4. And even then in the comics, there's still a certain awkwardness to it, just because like it's Mako having to deal with Korra and Asami's relationship now. And I don't think any like potential benefit that the breakup happening here gives to Korra and Asami's relationship is justified just because of what it does to Korra and Mako's relationship. Because even the writers continue come the end of the series with the idea that like Mako is Korra's best friend. There is a closeness there that even though they're not romantically involved, they are best friends that can rely on each other to help each other out with anything. They just, I feel they didn't do a good enough job on either side of like, I think it could have worked if they had maybe had the breakup, had them come back together, having now learned a little bit more about kind of development and relationships, better communication and stuff like that. Because like Korra obviously becomes kind of more responsible, more aware of what's going on here, and Mako also kind of has a little bit of an arc of his own. You could have had them come back together and maybe had the breakup happen at a later point in a less dramatic way. Or if you had to do it this way, I think you should have done Mako and Korra's relationship as friends and got that back on track much quicker than they actually did, which is basically like more or less still not back to any sort of the way it used to be. So that's why I criticize this episode so much. It's why I'm going to criticize the next episode a lot as well, because I feel it's the writers making some very harsh, quick decisions that have such a, I suppose, negative effect on Mako, especially as a character. I think Mako really suffers because of some of the events here. Now, of course, they give him his redemption moment with like the big turnaround with Lin, him becoming a detective and so on. But in terms of his, like, I suppose the respect he's sort of given by the other characters, he begins to be like treated as this like romantically inept character who has problems with relationships and stuff like that, and it just feels really weird that no, this is just the writers' bad writing, and then they more or less scapegoat Mako for that. They basically like have the fandom blame Mako for everything when the writers are actually the problem. So I've always had a major problem with how they've done things here. Especially because I think there's at least some potential in what they actually set up here of just their disagreements over everything. But I look back on like the first couple of episodes and how like they do the Korra and Mako sort of makeup scene in like episode 2, and how like they're sort of at odds in that episode and arguing a little bit with each other about sides and so on. But they have that moment where they kind of communicate and come back together. So this just feels like it's almost like they forgot completely about that scene that clearly showed that they can have little disagreements, but they can communicate well enough to get past them, and then they just forget about it completely here. So unfortunately, the interpretation more or less just has to be, I think, that it was there because they needed to have kind of Korra separate from everything. That she goes to Iroh to kind of behind Raiko's back to Iroh. Mako, has to reveal that this is Korra's plan. Raiko stops that from happening, so Korra's only plan is to head to the Fire Nation and get help from the Fire Nation military, because Zuko and Iroh's mother are probably going to help out Korra. But she's intercepted by Eska and Desna, and later a giant dark spirit before that can happen. And this is going to be the direct setup for beginnings, of course, with Korra not really being present in the next episode. So in that sense, it's a really good setup for beginnings. It's just how they got to Korra being on her own. You didn't have to do the breakup to do that. You could have had Korra just deal with the political failures that she encounters here, of Raiko disagreeing with her, Raiko kind of being involved in her meeting with Iroh, and her not really getting anywhere and going out on her own. The breakup, I don't think, was an important enough part of that it even needed to happen. The Nuktuk stuff with Bolin, not too much of a focus here, just that like, here he is, he gets the job, and he gets that role because Varrick notices him giving like interviews at the pro bending arena, and that he has this personality that just links with the crowd really, really well. He obviously gets the sort of pro wrestling idea of just like say the name of the town, compliment the fans, and that will get you a good reaction. But Varrick sees this potential for like, okay, I'm starting these movers things. Here is someone who is who the audience reacts to a lot. This will make my movers successful. So Bolin gets involved in that, and it feels like, oh, they found one of Bolin's talents. That's because he hasn't really had a role up to now. They've used him comedically. They've used him in the kind of comedic relationship with Eska. and the failure at the pro bending arena, but now suddenly here's something that he's good at, but is he just being kind of used? Is this just a case of like Varric has chosen someone who's like okay at this, but he's not actually great? It ultimately ends up, I think, helping him and giving him some confidence, because it sets up this other plot of like Mako kind of dismissing this new role that Bolin has, and there being a little bit of an issue between Mako and Bolin just over the fact that Mako sort of has things sorted out. He has a job path in a way, but Bolin is still trying to figure things out, and it kind of brings those two at conflict. Asami, as I said earlier on, this is them kind of committing to the final thing of just like the company's in a bad way. She's taking like a final risk on making some money from the war here by giving her like mecha tanks basically to the south. But we'll obviously see Varric make his move in the next episode. It's interesting that they focus so much on the company and just ignore completely Asami as a character herself. It's very frustrating to watch. On the Civil War front, we just get the idea that it's sort of a little bit of a standoff. The South are kind of doing kind of guerrilla tactics. They're hiding in the mountains, only doing kind of minor strikes. But Unalaq is for the most part ignoring them, because I think the thing that people say about this, like book 2, like they start a civil war, but the civil war doesn't feel important. And I think that's purposely meant to be the case, because fundamentally the Civil War plot is Varric's plot. It's not really Unalaq's plot. He is actually trying to unite the tribes. He obviously goes about it in like a very bad way. But it's Varric fundamentally who like brings things to the point where we really start a war. But even then, the way they set up the war is that the South can't handle the North because it's so powerful. So it's always going to be this kind of standoff type war that doesn't really have any major battles to it. We see a little bit, we see like the important engagements later on. But you can see just from Unalaq not really caring about what his brother's doing, that his focus is on completely other stuff. He really, for the most part, doesn't care that there's a civil war between the tribes. And I think that's just an interesting point, that the Civil Wars episodes were primarily about family, not the actual Civil War. Again, why it was called Civil Wars. So that was somewhat interesting. And I think that's most of the episode. Covering most of the characters. So it's a weird one. I like aspects of this in terms of setup, but it absolutely is one of the weakest episodes of Korra. It's where I think the writing decisions really start to stand out as being kind of very poorly done. And it's something that begins to really come into play with regards to some of the Korra stuff. Like, we're going to get to book 3, we're going to get to book 4, and just that there are some clear mistakes, I think, within each book made with regards to what they choose to tell, what they choose not to tell, focusing on some things but not on others. And it's the sort of stuff that Avatar didn't really have. That there are little issues here and there with like, oh, they should have made a slightly different choice within this one episode. But there's nothing that's so like impactful on the series as a whole, or characters and their entire arcs. But with Korra, they end up making some very, very weird decisions. And this episode, I feel, is like the start of some of that stuff with them. With Mako, with just making Asami feel very unimportant as a character. I suppose the other last point would be that Unalaq in a previous episode said to Korra that he doesn't need her to open the northern portal, but then he confirms here that he does need her. So I suppose this is him dealing with the fact that he realizes he made a mistake with how he handled Korra, thinking that he could sort of manipulate her to keep her on side, but not realizing that she is invested in her family in a way that even if they've lied to her about all this stuff, she's still going to fundamentally care about them more than just Unalaq presenting some good ideas to her. So that was, I think, well done. And it sets up the, I suppose, frustration moment for Unalaq, where him letting Korra go away, and then the result of this is that Eska and Desmond report back to him that, yeah, she was sort of killed, like we didn't see her come up, like she was more or less taken by a dark spirit, she's dead as far as we're aware. It becomes this like complete moment of just utter failure for Unalaq, where he feels he's failed, and we'll see that I think in the next episode or two. But yeah, that's been the review for Peacekeepers. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this episode. Do you agree with me that it's one of the weaker episodes? And do you agree on the exact moments in this episode where they, I think, really get it wrong? But yeah, that's been the review. Thanks for watching, and bye.